Hey, everybody, and welcome to Notes from the Other Side. This is a podcast for people who love Jesus but have some real concerns about Christianity. Here at Notes, we take a microscope to some of Christianity's thornier topics and people using a progressive theological lens and a socio-historical approach to studying the Bible. So if that sounds like your jam, come on in and have a seat. But buckle up, it might get bumpy. Okay, everybody, welcome back to Notes from the Other Side. This is a podcast where we take a microscope to some of Christianity's thornier topics and people. I'm your host, Tiziana Mom So Hard Severse. And the reason you're not hearing anybody ask me how my mom and so hard today is because it's just me in the studio with our very special guest. Y'all, straight from Utah, we've got social media superstar and one half of the Bible study podcast, Data Over Dogma, Dr. Dan McClellan.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm really glad you're here. We also do have, Rocket Man Andy Bishop back there.
He put me on camera.
Oh.
I have a face.
Excuse me.
I have a face for radio, but yes.
Hey, okay. Well, y'all, just so everybody's clear here, we are using a lot of technology that we don't generally use. And, I'm doing my best to not feel some type of way about that. So we got Andy back there. I didn't even know that was going on. But back to the focus of the show, which is not me prattling along. Dan McClellan. Sir, thanks so much again for being here. I'm just going to repeat myself. So we just did an interview with you, which is going to air on the Burrows of Berea podcast. So everybody that's listening, I want you to go hop over there and take a listen because it was really awesome. So what we're going to be doing right now is then just kind of picking up where we left off over there.
Sounds good.
In prep for this, not only do I watch your content, and I have watched your content for some time because as we all know, Andy likes to send texts out to everybody, and your content kind of came across in the texting.
I mean, it happened on more than one occasion that the things that were said in here, he would be on, just happened to be on something that, lined up with that. And I started sending them out, although I'm selective about it.
Yeah.
I don't always, because every once in a while I'm like, this one's for one person and not the group.
Yeah, you do that. Although the one time when we were doing the deep dive on same-sex relations in the Bible, you sent everybody one of Dan's TikToks because it mirrored what I said. And if I can't tell y'all the level of ego boost I got from that moment, because I mean we talk about this a lot on the show. We're just regular old folk trying to figure out how to love Jesus and each other and the world around us in the right way. And we all have the Bible as our foundational text, but we all also understand that comes with it a certain level of cultural Christianity and cultural understanding. Sure. And so when I say something that's super inflammatory that I think I'm the only person that's out here saying, and then Andy's like, no, this wicked famous dude also said that. I'm like, oh, Lord of mercy. Here we go. Ha! Ha! I knew it! But anyhow, so one of the things I was reading, because I read one of your papers, and I one of the things I'm most interested about is your doctorate. So your doctorate's in the cognitive science of religion.
Yes.
I want you to just tell me about that more. Tell our listeners about that more, because it's a fascinating field. It's a relatively new field.
What is that?
Yeah.
So it is basically any research that brings the cognitive sciences and in all its various different forms and iterations to bear on questions related to religion. And probably the two main kind of tracks that we see in a lot of the research have to do with deity concepts and then with ritual. Why ritual works. And so I think we can start speaking about the cognitive science of religion as a field in the 90s. We started to get some publications like Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds, which is an anthropomorphic theory of religion that deity is a spandrel, a side effect of some evolutionarily installed intuitions where we kind of intuitively impose anthropomorphism on an awful lot of the world around us. And that theory has been kind of reworked a bit since then. But from there, we talk about ritual theory. There are some wonderful scholars who've done a lot of great work trying to understand how ritual works, why it works. And then, it's just we've been trying to refine and develop the field ever since and trying to make sure we're using the right tools, trying to make sure our kind of provisional presuppositions that we use are still working, and that we are coming up with results that mean something. And
Yeah.
so it's a field that is quite young, and a lot of people are suspicious of it, but I think has an awful lot to offer as long as we're being careful about where we're taking it. And so in my doctoral dissertation, it's called Deity and Divine Agency in the Hebrew Bible. And the question that I was trying to answer is why we have divine images, idols, referred to as if they were the deity as well as if they were not the deity. We have this is not kind of dichotomy. And I, in doing earlier research for my second master's degree, where I incorporated a lot of cognitive linguistics into trying to understand what the Bible has in mind when it mentions deities, gods, I became informed about the cognitive science of religion through that and realized, hey, there's a lot more explanatory power in here related to how, not just what we mean when we say words related to deity, but how we think about what's going on with deity and divine agency and divine images. And so I develop a theoretical framework for the intuitive underpinnings for this perception that a divine image can both be the God and not be the God at the same time.
Right.
And it's based on research related to our what's called a theory of mind. The idea that we have to, in interacting with other people, we kind of project and simulate what's going on in the other person's head intuitively, not knowingly, but intuitively, so that we can engage them in a way that's going to result in whatever we want to get out of the conversation, whether it's to convince something or convince somebody of something, whether it's to try to get information out of somebody, whether it's trying to get them to do something you want them to do. We engage in conversations for a lot of different reasons, and we have this kind of an intuitive sense of what's going on in the other person's head that is guiding a lot of that. But that theory of mind, that projection of the notion of a mind, is not something that only occurs when we're actively engaging with other people. It's something our mind projects when we're watching a scary movie, and we have to go into the basement, and we come up the stairs a little quicker just because it's very dark down there. and we have in the back of our mind, there's maybe this thought of something coming out of the dark.
Even though it's your own house.
Yeah. And so that is a function of this evolutionarily installed theory of mind. We perceive minds all around us.
The active agent. That's what you were talking about
Yeah,
in your paper on Christology.
So,
like to imagine that there's an active agent behind even the most like seemingly innocuous of movements around us.
Yeah. There's this notion that there's a teleological bias. We tend to think that things happen because someone caused them to happen, some kind of agent with a mind. And that gets attributed to all kinds of natural events. If we are not using our reflective cognition, the other side of the spectrum of cognition, to overrule and control what's going on the intuitive side.
Monkey brain part.
Yeah, and one of the examples I use to try to help people understand the concept of divine images, because we look in the Bible, there's a lot of what's called anti-idol polemic.
Yeah.
They're worshiping gods made of wood and stone.
Yeah, look at how lame they are.
Yeah.
They can't even do anything.
But we do something very similar today that we don't really question. And that's, I bring up this somewhat of a literary / media motif. If you've ever seen a movie, a TV show, or maybe you've done it yourself, seen somebody in a cemetery talking to a headstone. It is, I argue, the exact same behavior.
Right.
We are treating a piece of material media as kind of a channel for the agency, the cognition, the mind of an agent that we cannot see, that is not there for our senses.
Would that be the same as when you're watching a vampire flick and someone holds out a crucifix?
The idea is similar, because it is related to things like Nehushtan in the book of Numbers. So when we have the fiery serpents that bite the Israelites, and Moses creates the bronze serpent and holds it up, and they have to look at it in order to be healed of the wounds. The idea there is that is channeling agency, and specifically this healing power. And so there's a sense that in which the crucifix is kind of like a divine image, in that it is channeling agency. But for the vampire motif, the agency is this, it's something that's going to defeat or ward off, or it's apotropaic. It's
I'm sorry, what?
apotropaic, warding off evil.
Okay.
So it functions apotropaically in that if you show it to the vampire,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have to retreat.
I've seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
well,
My favorite
I've
part is
seen
when he
the
takes the
Monster Squad.
hairspray, you know? Yeah.
Wolfman's
Yeah.
got nards.
I've made jokes. Yeah, right. I've made jokes about it. Like if Jesus ever comes back, like he's gonna have a PTSD response because there's all these crucifixes around, and he's gonna have a really hard time. I hope Jesus is doing his therapy.
What's the old Bill Hicks bit? Oh, everybody that loved Kennedy walked around wearing a little gun. Yeah.
Yeah, or just a photograph of Dealey Plaza or something like that. Weird story. My first time in Dallas when we moved there, I was driving around downtown and was like, I recognize this grassy knoll.
Oh,
and like
yeah.
I just accidentally
kidding.
drove right past it, and it's very small. I was surprised by how quickly it was like, and it's gone.
Isn't that fascinating?
yeah.
It like so large in American history, especially huge in American history. Dirt.
Right.
It's just
a
dirt,
little
pile
tiny
of
pile of
dirt.
dirt.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Pile
like
of
the
dirt.
Dead Sea or something. It's like really small. It's more like a pond, you know?
Dead Sea's pretty
Or the
big.
Sea of Galilee. Sorry, Sea of Galilee.
Sea of Galilee's pretty big. But the Jordan River is that's one where it's kind of small.
Yeah, see, okay.
Yeah, I think that's I totally forgot where we were going. We were still talking about
Wolfman has nards.
Wolfman has nards, right?
No, we were talking about, what was that word again? About
Apotropaic.
Apotropaic. I
Yeah.
gotta like write that down. Apotropaic.
That's a great word.
It's a great word. Yeah.
And it's
And
interestingly,
how this has to do with like, divine, with the ways that our brains are sort of hardwired to see agency even in like, things that are material.
yeah, and because if we don't have something that we can see or touch, we want something material imminent there.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something I talked about recently on a podcast with an archaeologist friend of mine. The Bible functions that way for an awful lot of people. And so when people say the Bible's you're treating the Bible like an idol, it's like you kind of have to in some ways. If
Yeah.
you think of reading the Bible as that's a means of bringing the Spirit, like you're treating the Bible as a divine image.
Some kind of portal too,
Yeah,
like a Ouija board, as it were, in
yeah,
some weird way.
If it's channeling
Yeah.
divine agency or power or the Spirit of God or something like that, it's doing precisely the same thing. And in my book, that is a revised version of my dissertation, I talk about how we see the text of the Torah, the law, being treated as a divine image in a lot of ways.
Real quickly, talk about your book because it's not out yet. Is that
Oh,
what you're
no,
talking
I
about?
was talking about my first book.
Oh, your first book.
Yes,
which,
called Adonai's Divine Images.
Right. Okay.
And that's an open access book.
I
You
see
can
that on
find
your
a
link
PDF.
tree.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's on
We'll
that.
put that in the show notes so people can go ahead and hop over there and find all your places and all your things.
Yeah. So far, everything I've published academically is freely
Yeah.
available on my link tree. But and so there are a lot of ways that the text of Scripture functions as a divine image. In fact, a lot of people know that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that we have in the world, but they're not. There's actually an older one. It is a single text. Well, it's two little silver scrolls that are only about an inch wide, and they're called the Ketephanom Silver Scrolls. And they have scratched into them a version of the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. But they're not for reading. They were rolled up tight, and they were kept in a little pouch, and they were apotropaic
They were an
amulets.
amulet.
Right. And so the earliest witness of any kind that we have to any biblical text ever, from about 600 BCE, it's functioning as a divine image. It is functioning to ward off evil because it has the divine name inscribed in it, and that has power, and that you roll it up tight. You have it in a little pouch that encases the little divine image, and then you can carry it with you. And every time it bounces against your chest, you're reminded you have the divine name with you. That power, that agency is there with you, and so it wards off. It keeps the evil away.
Crucifix and Aquanet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the slice of pizza with garlic in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's all functioning very similarly. But and my argument is that the Bible does not entirely get rid of divine images altogether. It just renegotiates what is appropriate divine imagery versus what is inappropriate. What are we going to sanction versus what are we going to eliminate?
Well, and who?
And who's allowed to use it, right?
Yeah.
Because the authorized user is or authorized source creator is a big part of that
Yeah.
of what is allowed and what isn't. Because the Urim and the Thummim, the Ark of the
Yeah.
Covenant,
Right.
these are all things that are doing the exact same thing that divine images do. Whether it's because we need it for apotropaic purposes, for divination, that's what the Urim and the Thummim and the
Yeah.
priest's chest breastplate and all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. That's what that works to do. The
Yeah.
Ark of the Covenant, I argue, is like a shrine model. It's a miniature temple
Yeah.
that houses divine images, and so the tablets of the law, and this is something else I argue in my book. A standing stone, so similar to like a headstone today,
Mhm.
is a classical divine image. We've discovered a Judahite temple in the southern Negev in Israel called Arad. There's a Holy of Holies. There's some incense altars, and then there was a standing stone. Looks no different from just a headstone you might find in an older cemetery today. In in the Pentateuch, we have, and in Joshua, we have Moses and then Joshua. They're commanded to write the words of the law on standing stones.
Right.
And then they make sacrifices to Adonai in front of them. So what we're doing is overlaying the new divine image on the old divine image. So we are kind of transferring divine image function. And now imagine if you shrunk down a standing stone with the words of the law on it to a miniature version that could go inside of a model shrine. What do you get? Little tablets with the law written on them.
Right.
So I argue that this story of how this box that contained little miniature divine images came to be. They were accounting for it as, oh, it's the words of the law. We got to write them down. We got to store them in this box. Probably originally it was a miniature temple that was intended to be miniaturized so that it could be mobilized. So you can take it.
Portable.
Yeah. So it becomes a military standard. You march it out before the army. It's like, look, that's our God represented through the divine images. And so,
Well, and Constantine and the cross, right?
yeah,
Having the cross march out before his soldiers so that he would be guaranteed victory because it signaled that Jesus Christ was in charge and
so
fighting with his army.
That's the war palladium.
Yeah.
And that is the physical signal that God is fighting for us. And so, God fights Israel's battles in the Hebrew Bible. And that's just the way to signal that God has approved and is fighting the battles for you, except if you don't get God's approval beforehand, which is what happens in the beginning of the book of Samuel. And the Philistines abscond with the Ark of the Covenant. But what do the Philistines say when they first march the Ark out? They say their gods have entered the camp. And then they take the Ark of the Covenant and they go and they put it in their Holy of Holies next to their own divine image. And then you have the Battle of the Divine Images,
Right.
where the image of Dagon falls over, and then we got to set him back up. And then the next day, the hands and the head are cut off. And so it's basically showing the Ark of the Covenant is the better divine image.
And that seems to be like the beef. And we talk about that a lot too, is like that's what the real beef was in the Hebrew Bible. The beef wasn't whether or not God, Adonai or Hashem is real and these other gods are not real. It's that God is just better.
Right.
And bigger and badder and stronger and all of that stuff. And like the fact that God leaves its own land and its own property in order to be with their people in all these other places sort of signifies the more powerful nature of this God.
Yeah. And that's what you have with the Exodus. I talk about two different examples of God losing home court advantage.
Yes.
One is 2 Kings 3. The other is the book of Exodus, where God goes down to Egypt to judge the gods of Egypt.
Uh-huh.
And so they are sovereign in the land of Egypt because every god is sovereign within their own nation where they are the patron deity. And so Adonai is outside of their purview, but successfully judges and condemns and defeats the gods of Egypt. 2 Kings 3, you have the Moabite king throws off vassalage when Ahab dies and Jehoram rises to the throne. And then Jehoram's got to put together a coalition of Israel and Judah and Edom, and they're going to go invade. And they get Elisha, the Yahwistic prophet, to come inquire of the Lord. And God says, I will deliver Moab into your hands. And then they go in and they're at the last city and the king's there and they're going to take the city. And then the king slaughters his son as a sacrifice on the city wall. And then the text says there was great fury against Israel, and they got up and left.
Right. They're like, they don't even go into the story. Now, there's been stelas found, right, from the other side of the story where, like, the Moabites are like, yeah, we whooped them good. Or something. You know what I mean? Like, Israel, the Hebrew Bible's like, and then the story's over.
Yeah. They're telling the story very tersely.
There's like, that's it, cut.
Yeah. And so the Mesha inscription was discovered,
Yes.
which is that Mesha was the king of Moab, may have been, and tells a story about, Chemosh told me to take Nebo, and so I went and I carted off the vessels of Adonai and brought them before Chemosh. And then it says the king of Israel invaded, and Chemosh drove them out
Yeah.
before us.
Yeah.
And so it's like a lot of apologists will point to the Mesha inscription and say, see, that is corroboration of this story in the Bible. And it's like,
Except
it
that,
also kind of sounds like corroboration that everybody knew that Chemosh defeated Adonai and the people of Israel. And Moab was not delivered into their hands,
Yeah.
at least according to the way that terminology is used in prophetic literature. And so the only reasonable way to read this text without having to invent a bunch of scenarios that are not in evidence is that the sacrifice catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who successfully defeated the Yahwistic forces.
Yeah.
Because Adonai lost home court advantage, was on foreign soil, and that was not their territory, and so they got driven out.
Right.
And so we have a story of God leaving home court and winning, and God leaving home court and losing.
Yeah.
And then there's a parallel story later on in 2 Kings 18 and 19. You have Sennacherib. Does the exact same thing to Hezekiah that they tried to do to Moab, which was Hezekiah rises to the throne. I'm going to throw off vassalage. Sennacherib mounts an invasion, comes in, gets all the way to the final city, is unable to take the final city. And the story, you've got a bunch of different versions of it. It's even in Isaiah 36 and 37, where Hezekiah has this intercessory prayer, and come save us, God, and then the angel of the Lord comes and slaughters 185,000 Assyrian troops overnight, and they wake up. Whoever they is that is already dead wakes up and discovers that, looks like we're already dead, and so Sennacherib has to retreat.
I hate that.
I hate when I wake up dead.
Yeah.
I know.
And so and then they have to retreat.
Yeah.
And the verbs that are used to refer to Sennacherib getting up and leaving are the exact same verbs that are used to refer to Israel getting up and leaving
Back in
after there's great fury
Right.
against them. And so they're parallel stories. One, they're kind of like, so then we left.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then there's another where it's like, we're going to dedicate 3 chapters to this. And even Isaiah is going to talk about it as well, because we're very proud of this moment.
Yeah, this was a big fat W.
Yeah. And the L, they just ran off.
Which is a funny thing, because that is the exact same accusation that people who deeply believe in the Hebrew Bible as factual and as actual literary fact rather than fiction will say that the Egyptians did to describe, like to erase the fact that they had all these enslaved people for all of this period of time. And that then these enslaved people found some way to escape. People are like, yeah, of course the Egyptians aren't going to talk about that because they're not going to talk about the fact that
The
they lost all
losses,
that.
yeah.
Well, neither are the Hebrew people. I mean, come on now, if you're going to point fingers, y'all.
Yeah, well, and the Egyptians did write about losses. They just lied about them.
That's traditional, to be fair.
Yeah, like you have Kadesh Barnea, I think, is a piece of property that Egypt controlled at one time, and there was a big battle, and at best it was a draw.
Yeah.
I believe they were fighting against the Hittite Empire. At best, it was a draw, but I think Egypt was trying to get property back, and no property changed hands.
Yeah.
But then when you read about it on the Egyptian side, it's we routed them, and the Pharaoh went out on his own and defeated all of them. So they wrote about it, they just lied about it.
Yeah.
But we find in 2 Kings 3, they wrote about it, and they didn't lie about it. They just had to
They just didn't talk about it.
Yeah, they were just kind of like,
done.
look, it happened, we're moving on.
I
And
know.
don't bring it up again.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about it. Yeah.
But when you tell people, hey, there's this story about God being defeated by the God of another nation in the Hebrew Bible, and they get upset.
Well, now this is the thing. But this is the issue, right? So back to your original discussion, the cognitive science of religion, right? And imagine that within that study, there's also the cognitive dissonance that happens between and what ends up happening. when we have these conversations and we're throwing around all these $10 words, right? And we're talking about, the evolutionary purpose of the recognition of an active agent and how it helps, blah, 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 blah. What ends up happening is it creates this dichotomy. So then are these things real or not real? Right? Because if you're saying that it's just an evolutionary process, it's just a function of the way the mind works, then that necessarily then means that there's no such thing as spirituality. There really isn't somebody chasing you up the stairs. There really isn't some mysterious force that knocked that thing off the wall. And so for people that have this deep belief, what you end up having is called the backfire effect, right? Which is where when you present factual evidence or you present evidence to people that refute a deeply held belief, their amygdala goes, no, there's a fire, we're in trouble. And they will double down on that false belief. But is there a world where we can all live in where both the spaces are real, quote unquote?
Well, you actually have two sides to this within the cognitive science of religion, because there are plenty of scholars who work in the field who are believers. In fact, Justin Barrett, who developed the hyperactive agency detection device theory, is a Catholic and has written on the interface of cognitive science of religion and theology. And so it's you have all different kinds. There are some folks who argue that, see, this proves that religion is innate,
right? That
it is natural. And other folks who say, see, this proves that religion isn't real, that it's all an illusion.
Yes.
But all of our experience of the world is mediated by our cognition.
Yeah.
And we're never directly experiencing the world. We're experiencing the world our minds are projecting onto our experience. Right. And I use, sometimes to illustrate this, I'll use different optical illusions that, and I'll show, you don't decide to see this optical illusion, you see it no matter what. And I'll show ways to like turn it off, but it's always automatically there.
Yeah.
And that's just one sense.
That's
where
a really neat way of explaining that. It's just like an optical illusion. Yeah, that's great.
And the one I use has to do with two objects, one on top, one on the bottom, and one looks like it's much, much lighter and the other is much, much darker. But if you cover up the seams in the middle where they seem to be overlapping, you see that they're both the exact same shade of gray.
Yeah.
And the explanation is that your mind thinks this is an object in space. It's used to seeing light coming from above, so it thinks the object on top should be lighter in color because the object on the bottom is in the shadows and it should be darker. And so our minds are basically telling us how we're going to experience this image. And we can't just say, okay, mind, turn it off. That's not how our minds work. And so everything that we're experiencing is an illusion to one degree or another.
Yeah.
It's just that some of these illusions correspond more closely to reality and some of them do not. And so I think there are folks who acknowledge that there's nothing wrong with people enjoying the way they're experiencing the world. I mean, not the notion that if you're not experiencing the world exactly as it is, you're doing something wrong or false or something like that is, I think, is pretty ridiculous, because
there is no is, right? It's all just how you experience it.
Yeah, reading a book, watching a movie, you're creating this stuff in your mind, which is not there. And so, but at the same time, when people leverage religion to try to structure power, and that hurts people, that's obviously a way that feature of our cognition can be misapplied and misused and abused in order to abuse others. And so I think there's a lot of discussion that still needs to go on regarding that. But there are an awful lot of folks who are so embedded in their dogmatism, they're not interested in even considering the question.
Yeah.
The cognitive dissonance is a lot deeper than that. They're not like, okay, I want to grapple with this, I want to sit in this tension. They just deny the tension exists altogether. For instance, I did a video today where somebody was like, God's signature is embedded in our DNA.
I saw that.
You saw that?
You were like, that's actually a bunch of horse pocky. Like, it's actually not even real at all.
Not at all. Totally fake.
Can you catch me up? Just give me the 2-cent version of that.
So this is something that started back in 1986. Somebody said, if you look at DNA, the strands, the base pairs are held together by these sulfuric bridges, and they occur every 10 pairs, every 5 pairs, every 6 pair, and then every 5 pair again. 10, 5, 6, 5. And if you convert that to Hebrew letters, because there's a number with every Hebrew letter, you get Yod He Vav He, or the divine name. So God signed this creation, and God's signature is in our DNA. And so sulfuric bridges have absolutely nothing to do with the base pairs of DNA. And if they hold together all the base pairs, then they are not occurring at any intervals. They're happening every time.
Would fall apart.
Yeah. Right. And so I pointed this out, and the creator of that video then hopped in the comments to get on my case, saying, "Oh, this brings a lot of people to Christ." I was like, "You're lying."
Yeah.
Bringing people to Christ through lying.
And I love that he didn't even there wasn't even a denial. It was just but this tool is doing what I want. But you're like, but it is,
And then they were like, "Oh, you just hate religions." Like, I'm a Christian. And they're like, "What kind of Christian?" I was like, "Oh my God."
Oh yeah.
So, and this creator was just not even going to consider this, was just totally concerned for the implications of me shutting down her trying to bring people to Jesus, even though the overwhelming majority of her content is we're living in the last days. We're so close to coming home, people, and it's just fear mongering and spreading just asinine conspiracy theories and lies. But for her, the defensive walls were fully operational. Shields were up. She was not even going to think critically about that.
And you get to this place, too, where people are like demanding more evidence of your faith and therefore gatekeeping Christianity and who gets to be a Christian, what kind of Christian is the right kind of Christian and all this other stuff, which also sort of like lends to the heart of this issue is your Data Over Dogma podcast is what people deeply believe in their hearts because it feels comforting. It feels good. That it feels like, great big Papa in the sky is wrapping his arms around you and you're not alone, versus people that are like, well, now hold on a second. Let's have like a rational conversation about this. Let's use the data to discuss this. And when you are pushing back against something that makes people feel deeply safe and deeply loved and deeply cared for, you're like ripping that rug out from underneath them.
You're like saying, great big Papa doesn't exist. Also, you're in a complete free fall and you can't even barely control it. And they're like, thanks.
But that becomes the conversation, right? Like what's real versus what's not real. And nobody, in this context and conversation, you never once said, God isn't real, or I don't believe God is real, or like you're just an ignorant whatever. You just challenged this particular belief system because it was based on knowledge that's not real, and you weren't trying to put up a place of correct belief within that construct. And you just get, how many times have you been to the principal's office in your personal life? Like how many of your own family members, do you know what I'm saying? How many times do you get called on the carpet when, because I'm sure there are other people in your faith community that are like, Dan, you better just.
Well, within my family, I don't have that. My family is wonderfully supportive, and they're my biggest fans, both in my household and within my more extended family. In-laws, they're supportive, but they disagree with me on an awful lot of stuff. But in my faith community on Twitter, I get dragged to hell and back every day. But there are people who have never been accused of being particularly thoughtful or informed. So I don't care.
Well, so here's the other part of that problem, because I do the same thing, right? Like I function in my family. I was raised fundamentalist Christian, and so I was raised that the planet is only 7,000 years old. The accounts of creation in the Hebrew Bible are literal and factual and real. And if you don't believe that every single word in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be reconciled, who cares that there are 4 different versions of the gospel and that they are in any way, shape, or form the same and that they're not supposed to be the same? You can't reconcile them, then it means that your fragile belief system is going to completely crumble, and you're going to destroy everybody's faith, right? I grew up that way, and then I did that. And I made a lot of people mad. Yeah. Nobody in my family listens to my podcast. They can't.
Yeah.
And so, but I think part of it comes back to think critically and Google responsibly. Competently. Sorry, yeah. Google competently. we don't know how to do that. We're not taught that in school.
No.
And so when I bring to people in my family, I've brought your content and I'm like, hey, look, you can, they're like, I did Google it. Well, now hold on a second.
This is also a brand new problem, right?
Right.
Yeah.
This is like, think about even like our age. You didn't have to Google competently in the 90s, right? Because
You Encyclopedia Britannica competently.
Right, and this,
yeah.
Yeah, mainly the internet was for slowly getting porn to,
That's right.
to
one
slowly
one line at a
download.
time.
Yeah, so
And we weren't in that world of so much information and the ability for it to be shared so widely. So what you largely had was access to better sources, except for when you like listened to your uncle or something like that. So we weren't dealing with this problem in anywhere near the same way. And plenty of people alive, that was most of their life.
And I think the internet is in large part democratized the data so that it's out there, it's accessible, most of it for most
Right.
people. But people think that because they have access to all the data, suddenly they know what's going on. But raw data has no meaning, just like squiggles on a page have no meaning until you are there to bring your understanding of how to configure those data to turn it into something. And this is why people spend so much time. I don't know how many times people will respond to my videos by saying, it only took me 3 minutes of Googling to disprove you. And I was like, take more than 3 minutes next time. That's the problem. Because confirmation bias is you saying, I know that's wrong. Google, there's the first hit that
first
says
article that agrees with me.
Right. Yeah.
But also the internet figures out who you are and how you like to Google. So like, for example, we had a conversation in here around 1 Timothy and whether or not it was pseudepigraphal or not. And I'm like, obviously Paul didn't write that crap, whatever. And then everyone's all like, excuse me, ma'am. And I'm like, look, it doesn't mean it's not important and that it doesn't have value and that we can't learn from it. That's not important. All I'm saying is Paul didn't write it,
Yeah.
And then that's another area where I got in trouble because then Dr. Eric Smith was like, well, that's not the consensus. So, well,
Oh, what is your?
it's okay.
Okay.
Let me correct myself because I do not want to add a whoops to this. What Dr. Eric Smith said is that there's new scholarship out that talks a little bit about how the work was transcribed by different people and that sometimes those people were marginalized community members because they were often slaves and that sometimes they found ways to put their own belief systems within the context of whatever Paul was saying. Whatever. The point is, when I Googled, is Paul pseudepigraphal, is 1 Timothy a pseudepigraphal work? The first 7 things are like, yeah, absolutely, because my internet knows who I am, right? My Google has figured me out. And so I had to look harder for the scholarship that suggests, well, now hold on a second. Let's look at this differently, right? Let's just look at this from the other side of the conversation. And so
May we have Dan's take on that
real
quick?
Okay. Go ahead. I wasn't trying to pick up that particular beef exactly,
No.
but please feel
I just
free.
want to know, and then we could bounce right off it if we.
It sounds like the response is pulling from Candida Moss's recent book, God's Ghostwriters.
Yes.
But Candida would not agree that her scholarship means that 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus were written by Paul. She would wildly disagree with that. I believe. I'm pretty sure Candida agrees with me and with, I think, still the majority of New Testament scholars that the data indicate Paul did not write 1 Timothy. It's not just a question of style. It's also a question of content, and there are a lot of different things that go into that. But
whether or not then did he dictate it is the question,
no,
right? So
because
then,
it was probably written long after he was dead, so his dictation skills had deteriorated significantly.
They were terrible at that point.
So
just mumbles, really bad.
You know what? At that point, mumbles, that would be very good.
Well, that'd be miraculous.
We had the headstone, so we could just go ask.
Okay, I guess.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
All right.
okay. So, but what I'm saying is, so what I'm curious about, and I'm not sure exactly how the listeners what they're going to want to do, but for my own personal life, when I'm gently having conversations with my beloved family members that believe the Earth is flat, when I'm having conversations with deeply beloved family members who are like, obviously, immigrants are eating dogs because that's what they said. So what I'm asking is, how does one go about properly vetting and researching
Yeah.
from the beginning, because your TikToks cover an absolutely astounding array
It's
and
huge.
range
Yeah.
of topics. It is impossible that you are well versed in every single one of those topics. So you yourself must also occasionally hop on the Googles
Quite
and do a
frequently,
little
yeah.
bit of tippity tappity.
Yeah.
So walk us through the process of how one is going to be able to Google competently. How do we
So
do that?
what I would say is learn to recognize sources that are reliable from sources that are not reliable.
Okay.
And sources that are reliable are generally going to be peer-reviewed publications, because what that means is that this person had to put this research and the claims in front of other experts, and those experts had to at least agree that the argument was followed standards of the field, was logical, properly used evidence, and things like that. So the best outcome from Googling is going to be peer-reviewed scholarship. But even that is not perfect. That still fails all the time, which is why you like there's what was the claim? The Shroud of Turin. They found the blood on it was blood from someone who had been tortured. And you go look at that peer-reviewed scholarship, and if you pull it up today, there's a big red retracted across the front
Right.
of the paper, because it was significantly criticized after it passed peer review,
Yeah.
and they demonstrated the outcomes, the claims, the conclusions are not supported by the data.
The scholarly version of
Was it blood? Was it blood or was it not blood?
I don't think there was blood, because that's a long story.
Okay,
but,
yeah,
but
sorry.
For more on this, go listen to the most recent Data Over Dogma. Because I listened to you guys talk about that the other day. So,
but and so if you just go look for a website and you say, well, this website says it, it's like websites can say anything.
yeah.
There's literally no authority anywhere going, hey, website, you said something that's not true.
Right.
And so websites will even say, this scholar over here said this, and it's like the scholar doesn't say that at all. And so the best way to Google is to look for reliable sources. And usually that's going to be, if you've got primary sources, so the original text themselves, that's the best. Or if you got some kind of documentation, video footage, or audio recordings or things like that, depending on what you're looking for.
Right.
Primary sources are the best. The problem is when it comes to the Bible, a lot of people cannot read a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. They need someone to read it for them. And an awful lot of people who are presenting themselves as mediators of that information are not good faith mediators. And so you will get a lot of different, the quality of the information will differ. And this is why I prioritize the scholarly consensus. People think I say scholarly consensus, therefore incontrovertibly true. And that's not even remotely what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, if you trust me to be accurately representing the scholarship, if you trust me to be a good faith communicator of the scholarship, then if I say this is what the scholarship agrees is most likely, the majority of scholars agree this is most likely, therefore this is the consensus, I'm trying to be a trustworthy channel for what arguments, what conclusion, what finding has the agreement of the majority of scholars right now. And so I think that's the best shorthand for getting from I have this question to this is where we seem to be right now. And that doesn't mean it won't change. It changes all the time. And some of the stuff I present is actually directly challenging the scholarly consensus. But if you can find scholarship that says this is the consensus view, that's probably the best case scenario for whatever.
Which means go to Google Scholar.
Right. Scholar.google.com is a great place to look for scholarly publications. Now, there are a lot of publications in there that are not peer-reviewed. There are a lot of publications that are confessional, that are faith-based. So when it comes to Bible-related content, you need to weed through an awful lot of that as well. But if you can find stuff that's published by reputable publishers that is peer-reviewed and that there seems to be widespread agreement on, that's about the best you can do with that kind of stuff. Also, that it's up to date.
And that is up to date. And that's the thing though too, like I think this is difficult because when I do my deep dives for notes, I always start with like the textbooks that I have from my master's program. So first of all, you have to have access to texts from a master's program.
Yeah.
You have to be able to have the financial resources to purchase texts from a master's program.
Right. And yeah, there's an awful lot of gatekeeping, and
Right.
You have to pay money to access some of those
Absolutely.
resources, which is
Yeah.
why you should never go to libgen.rs, and you should never go to annas-archive.org.
Oh,
Yeah. So just fair warning.
yeah. User
You should
beware.
stay away from those sites.
Tell me more about those websites, because I've never come across those websites. And
So there are an awful lot of folks operating outside the United States, and some in the United States, who are trying to make scientific research and other scholarship more accessible through.
And we shall not go there.
Yeah, just stay away from those places.
Yeah.
Anyway, but that's what I'm trying to do as well, is to try to democratize access to this kind of stuff.
So, and that's one of the things that I love about, like, because I with your link tree, you've got links to all of the stuff that you've published. It's all open access, and so like I read one of your papers. Like, I make it sound like I'm some kind of whatever. I am absolutely not. I read a paper, okay, and like 4 of the pages was just bibliography. So I didn't, but 2 things. Number one, whenever I'm doing this research, I'll go to Google Scholar, and I don't have access. So, I mean, I can read the abstract of a thing, but unless I want to pony up $29.99 for that article, I don't have access to that. And so it necessarily narrows the field of opinion, because the only people who I get to read are the people who feel like it's valuable to post their opinion online.
Yeah.
And that also means that they're the kind of people that think it's valuable to post their opinion online. And so this is one of the challenges I think that we run into, and why I think we have the spread of misinformation, and especially the spread of misinformation regarding religious beliefs and systems, is because I have 2 choices. I can cling to a quick TikTok that makes me feel really warm and fuzzy, or I can present myself at the gate of academia and then stand there and be judged for my financial and intellectual capabilities before I'm allowed to enter and scroll through the archives. And that can be really challenging for people.
Yeah, and then when you do get access, sometimes it is still inaccessible. The writing might be difficult to understand, or sometimes people ask me to respond to stuff related to like physics, and it's like, I don't know how to do any of that. I'm like, I can see the equations, and for me, everything just turns off. I don't know. So sometimes it can be too technical. Sometimes the writing can be too dense. Again, sometimes it can be far too outdated. Sometimes the best scholarship is in German. Maybe you don't speak German.
Right.
And so that's something that scholarship needs to address on its own. And there are an awful lot of folks, myself included, who are trying to advocate for making this stuff more accessible, because a lot of us do believe that there is a lot of importance to what we do. A lot of it is technical minutia that nobody will ever care about. But sometimes that leads to broader observations and conclusions that do have relevance to important social issues today. And so I think we do need to improve things when it comes to public scholarship. For instance, public scholarship used to not really count toward tenure for a lot of people's, for academic review and things like that, for people who teach at universities. And there now are universities that are starting to take public scholarship into account as something that ought to contribute to somebody's academic development if they're teaching at a university, which means that they can now dedicate more of their time on the clock to things like public scholarship. So hopefully that means that public scholarship will increase and will improve, and we'll have a lot more people available, because as you observed, and as I have frequently said, I cannot remotely be an expert on all things. And so I'm relying on a lot of my colleagues in the field to help me out as well, not just providing information for me if I'm looking for it, but also correcting me when I get it wrong, which I do. And so there are a lot of ways that we need to do things better. And but I think people are starting to see the issues, and I think we're moving towards solutions on the grassroots level, from a bottom up level. There are a lot of large institutions, however, that have an awful lot of say here, that don't recognize the problems.
Yeah. Well, and it also comes an issue of in-group versus out-group policing too. You know, because it's a very, like you said, you confronted this particular content. You didn't even confront the creator, because you always say on your things, do not harass this creator.
Yeah.
You're just challenging the validity of the claim itself, right?
Yeah.
So you say this thing and people immediately start wanting to make sure you're in group before you have the right to police.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also part of it too. It's like you're saying, you've got all of these scholars that are starting to be like, hey, we are a part of this team. We are actually the people writing the stuff. So they say, we are part of this team and we want to make this more accessible. We want to find a way to make the work that we're doing more available. And so it's like, we need, you know, more people inside the realm of Christianity gently questioning some of these content creators and some of this misinformation, but from the place of like in group love, like, hey, I'm here. I believe you know, that these spiritual texts are important. We believe that, you know, having this relationship with the divine, however you are manifesting it in your faith tradition right now, is important. I'm not trying to challenge that, but I'm just trying to help you understand, you know, I wish it turned into more of like how you've been duped instead of like how you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's really important, because that foundational conversation of whether or not you're stupid, that's created such a giant wedge in our country on such a wide variety of levels, right? Like that the stupid people are like, we're not stupid, we'll show you. And they're not stupid. There's all different kinds of knowledge. You know, I've known people that can't read that I would absolutely have on my apocalypse team. You know, like if everything went to hell in a handbasket, that is the first brother I would call.
How do you even address that to somebody? Like, what? It's so difficult to be like, even you're wrong feels frequently like an attack. It's so difficult to even start that conversation.
Yeah, and that's one of the other another feature of our intuitive cognition. If we've internalized this concept of identity, and we've got all these dogmas tied up in that identity, when you criticize the dogma, intuitively it feels like
Personal.
you're criticizing you personally. And that's just a natural part of being human. The social identities that are most central to us are tied up in that, and criticizing that feels like criticizing us. And it also it gives us that little intuitive pinch that makes us feel bad. Because you're saying, oh, this is wrong, this is bad. I was like, oh, my worldview is bad.
Right.
My identity is bad. And so it just leads to this discomfort intuitively that you then want to get rid of. And so the quickest and the most efficient way to get rid of that bad feeling is not to work through the bad feeling. It's to deflect the bad feeling, and you double down to make yourself feel like, oh, no, I am right. This is good. This is okay. And so I have to take that and I have to push back against it. And so it's an intuitive feature of cognition that's not going to go away, which is why people are so quick to throw up those defensive shields. But you talked about talking with people within your own family. Your best chances of actually getting people to take those defensive shields down is people with whom you have a close personal relationship, or people who have had personal experiences that are going to make them think twice about these things. Because you can just barf data at someone for eternity.
Yeah.
But that intuitive and digging in your heels and doubling down is going to be the most natural reaction to that, until you can get them to think, okay, this is someone I trust. This is someone whose opinion of me I care about.
Yeah.
This is someone whose relationship I don't want to compromise. I don't want to weaken. And so I need to, therefore, think critically about this.
Right.
And so that's the best, most reliable way to make that happen, which is also the hardest way to make it happen, and the least common way that you're going to be able to make it happen.
What's that famous black guy that... I don't remember his name, but he started making friends with all these
with the KKK?
Yeah, he just like that one man, just like
and
he must have been a cool hang. That's all I gotta say.
Yeah, some people have a skill at doing that. That wouldn't have been my approach, but he's obviously a more compassionate person than I am when it comes to that kind of thing. But that's one way to do it, and there are folks for whom that approach wouldn't work. But maybe one day hey, this is hateful and awful behavior. Do better. Maybe that approach works one day. So there's
Yeah.
not one silver bullet for every situation. It's going to be different for everybody. But yeah, close personal relationship, personal
Right.
experiences are the most reliable way to get people to let down the shields.
Well, because that's the second thing that happens when you, like you're saying, so when someone challenges a dogma or an ideology that's highly attached to identity, you feel like you personally are being attacked. You run away from that source of information, and you run towards the people that believe the way that you do, because that's what causes the soothing. I'm not alone. I'm in this group of people.
Right.
And that also is what creates this echo chamber that we find ourselves in, where like we are so incredibly divided in and amongst, on a political level, on a level, a spiritual level. It's like we have all of these great big decisions in front of us as a nation, and you are on one side or you are on the other.
Yeah.
And that's part of it, because you feel like you have to flee from the shame and the anxiety of having an identity challenge and run directly to the people that feel like you.
And it's not limited to religion.
Yeah, exactly.
And then nobody's immune.
Right.
A lot of people, a lot of progressive folks like to imagine, oh, we don't do that kind of thing. No.
Yeah.
If you're human, you do that kind of thing. You just don't recognize it all the time.
It's easy to think you're the exception. It really is.
Yeah. And it extends to everything. There are people out there who like the Las Vegas Raiders. And I mean, I can't comprehend, but and so I make a joke about it because I am a Broncos fan.
Yeah.
And so that's another example of the exact same kind of behavior, because every time I say something about the Broncos on TikTok, I get a bunch of people who are like, boo.
Right.
And I read a comment and I feel that intuitive pinch, and I'm like, no, I'm a good person.
Yeah, sure.
And so it extends to all aspects of our social identities, not just when it comes to religion or important social questions, and everybody does it.
Which is absolutely wild if you think about this in terms of, let's narrow it back down to Christianity and the function of Christianity, which is a spiritual practice that involves a reconciliation of humanity to God through Jesus Christ, through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the words of Jesus Christ. However you define that Christology, that's the foundation of it, right? And what does Jesus say, right? If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn and let them slap the other. If someone steals your shirt, give them your cloak. Like the whole entire message of that being when they were walking around had to do with not clinging to like your definition of God in such a way that excluded all these other people, not clinging to your anger, not clinging to your like jealousy, not clinging to that stuff. So what we're left with is what we're supposed to be doing. If you are a Christian and you are a practicing Christian and that's something that you want to do, you're supposed to be actively working against that knee-jerk intuitive response in order to live a life that we believe would be more in line with the will of God, which is like, then why'd God make us that way? Like that.
And when you look at and Jesus is represented a variety of different ways, and even within individual gospels, there are a bunch of conflicting perspectives on what Jesus wants from you. But when you look at the people that Jesus most consistently criticized for praying on the street corner to be seen of men, for they have their reward.
Yeah.
And that's an example of costly signaling, credibility enhancing displays.
Yes.
Look in group at how good I am at doing the things the in group says I should be doing.
Right.
That's a perfectly natural way to engage a social identity. And that's what Christians are doing. I think Driscoll's got a new book coming out, Vote Like Jesus. You can imagine this is an example of the exact same kind of stuff. And the people who come onto my channel and be like, I'm bringing people to Jesus just because it's not true doesn't you mean I shouldn't be bringing. And this is another example of trying to put on display that you are behaving in line with what is expected of you given your social identity. So I need to have I got to find some kind of shorthand for pointing out when someone's praying on the corner to be seen of men, because that's like the majority of stuff that goes on social media related to Christianity, particularly Christian nationalism.
They're busking.
precisely praying on the street corner to be seen of men, because the reward that they get is that somebody goes, they're one of the good ones. They're one of that person has more credibility in my eyes as a Christian, as a Christian nationalist, as an American, as a white person, whatever. And so it's the folks who are the most belligerent about following Jesus are the folks who are most likely to do the thing that Jesus most consistently condemned. And it's because that's the natural intuitive reaction, but people aren't interested in thinking critically about their own behavior. They're interested in trying to criticize other people's behavior. So
Well, and I think that comes to, the first step to that is a level of self-awareness, asking yourself, do I believe what I believe because, this is what I believe, or do I believe this is what I believe because I just learned it or was taught it at such a young age that I had I met Jesus Christ when I was 6 years old, had this like incredible experience, like of my own experience, like totally apart from like my parental involvement or in a church or anything. It was wild. But then I started going to church, and I studied a lot, and I asked a lot of questions, and there was a lot of questions that I was told, like, that's above your pay grade, little girl.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And
Drink the milk before the meat.
yeah,
stuff.
right. Which also means acclimate yourself to what we are telling you before you ask questions
Yeah.
when we have a specific way we want you to believe the answer
You
to
need
that
to
question.
be inoculated.
Right, exactly. And so like half the reason I went to seminary is just because I wanted to ask those questions in an environment where I wasn't going to be spoon-fed the exact same thing over and over and over and over. And like for most people, so when I got to that place, that was the first time I ever heard that the 4 versions of the gospel were different on purpose because they mattered to 4 different faith communities, and they were included in canon because they were 4 different stories that mattered to 4 different communities. And for so many people, I can appreciate how destabilizing that can feel.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I was like, oh, thank
Yeah.
God. Oh, man, I can let this go. This thing that's been like twisting in my mind all this time, I can finally just like, I'll be like, oh, okay. Like they're not supposed to be the exact same.
One of the most rewarding parts of what I do is I get messages and comments frequently from people who will say, oh, this heals trauma that I have been dealing with my whole life, because things click into place when you're allowed to address them head on. And I think a lot of people go to seminary because they want that. But and here's another feature of the gatekeeping. An awful lot of seminaries require that their faculty sign statements of faith that prohibit them from saying certain things. I don't think people realize, or I don't think people know just how many of the publications they cite as their response to critical scholarship are written by people who are contractually prohibited from agreeing with certain aspects of critical scholarship.
Fascinating.
Yeah, there are, and as public funding for the study of religion and the Bible in like state-sponsored schools goes down, the people who are there to replace the scholars whose positions are no longer being funded are more and more Bible colleges and seminaries and people who are contractually obligated to toe a certain theological line. And so that's another problem with scholarship and with addressing the sources that you're finding on Google. Because even if you go to Google Scholar, a lot of people don't know how to find out if the person who published this paper is contractually prohibited from saying the conclusion they're arguing against.
How do you find that out, Dan?
Well, you have to go, that gets complex too, but you have to find out where a scholar is working, who's their employer, and then find out if that is an employer who requires their faculty sign statements of faith.
Or who funded the study.
Yeah, so sometimes that means going and looking at universities or not even university, Bible college or seminary websites to find out what they expect of their faculty. And we've got a lot of examples of scholars challenging things like inerrancy. There was a scholar who, I don't remember if they lost their job or were just condemned by their colleagues for a long time because they said, maybe the part in Matthew where all the dead people rose up and appeared to their families after Jesus's death and resurrection, maybe that didn't actually happen, and was just dragged for
Yeah.
years because of that. And there are people who have lost their jobs because they stood up for LGBTQIA communities. There are people who have lost their jobs because
Yeah.
they stood up against misogyny and said that
Yeah.
that women are equal there because they were contractually obligated to toe a certain line. And so the people who are actively publishing certain scholarship are doing so because their contracts require them to. And then we also see people who, when they oppose that, they lose their jobs. And so
Yeah.
that's
One
a big force in biblical scholarship right now.
one of my professors at ILIF, Dr. Miguel de la Torre, that was a big part of like his life because he was teaching at like a certain college, like a Baptist college or something. Let me stop right now because I'm going to say the wrong thing. I don't know exactly where he was teaching. He was teaching somewhere and he did that thing. And he refused to sort of like toe the party line about a certain thing. And so he, was very unceremoniously like removed from his office. And that's when he started working for ILIF. And I think it kind of became like a point of pride,
Yeah.
And that like, no, I stood for what I stood for. I said what I said. I mean what I said. And I'm not gonna be coerced, into saying something that I don't believe just because that's what, the powers that be want me to do and say and believe. It is so complicated, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's and like this, like it makes me think back, to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Do you know? I think that we miss that part a lot. Like, we just all so deeply want to believe that the Bible's very clear about that. Whenever someone says that to me, I'm like, you have not read it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry. The Bible's not clear about anything.
Yeah. Anyone who believes in the perspicuity of Scripture should go translate a Dead Sea Scroll or two.
Well, and that was one of the things that I think like. One of the things I got, because I did the same thing. I got my hackles up when we were having that one episode where we were talking about one of your TikToks, and I just like went on this like giant rant about like inconsistencies within the manuscripts and like the manuscripts are more different than they are the same. And don't you know, like I also haven't read the actual manuscripts, okay? Because I don't speak Hebrew and I don't speak Greek. And not only do I not speak Hebrew and Greek, I don't speak ancient Hebrew, which is not the same as current Hebrew, and I don't speak ancient Greek, which is not the same as current Greek, and I got myself I found myself doing that thing, where I just like dug my heels in. And that's when I had to come back and do a big fat whoops because I let my emotional brain take over, and I let my own belief system about how certain ways of thinking are dangerous, right? Go, no. You can't think that way, and it got me all aflutter. It's so hard to do because it's so deeply tied to our fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms. I mean, we don't realize just how much our emotional brain is operating at all times in the background.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult just as an individual human being walking on the planet, right? That person is driving in their own car, not thinking about you at all. They don't even know who you are, and they don't give an F what you are up to. They're not thinking about you, but we have this like fight, or fleas. That person's trying to get me, and the same thing happens, and it's just so unfortunate, like you were talking about. When the stakes are so high, I know so many people, and specifically in the LGBTQIA plus community, right, that, are just standing on the outside looking in, going like, but I've had an experience with this spiritual practice. I've had an experience with this Jesus entity. I've had an authentic connection to something I can't explain, and I want to go in. But I saw a church the other day had a cute little quip on its reader board that was like, come as you are, you can change once you get here. That's not funny, and that's not love.
Yeah.
Like we act like, oh, the mainstream party line of like fundamentalist Christianity is like this loving, come as you are, you're welcome, you're loved as you are. Bullshit. Because only if you are willing to change once you get here, that is the qualifier to the first statement.
Yeah.
That first statement has a qualifier. And that's not authentic love. If the expectation is, but you're going to change once you get here.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for a level of healing that happens. The more, rather than change, healing is the word. As somebody heals from their sexual trauma, they might naturally drop a porn addiction. As someone heals from their, biological, the car accident that they were in, maybe they will lose their addiction to the pain pills, right? But it's about healing rather than change. And when we have this there's this like quiet underlying theme to the message of Christianity that's like, yes, you are loved as you are, but you will become the Borg.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to point out, when you point out Jesus dined with tax collectors and sinners, people are like, well, that's because he was calling them to repentance. It's like, well, the closest you get to that is him saying, those who are whole do not need a physician, but I'm here to heal.
Yeah.
And the word for in Greek, one of the words that is frequently translated save is actually heal. And so
that makes my little heart, just like my little pastoral counseling and care degree heart, go, aw.
And at the same time, though, tax collectors and sinners, tax collecting is not a sin.
Yeah.
What are tax collectors? What are they? What do they need to change?
Quit doing the dirty work of the Romans.
Well, but the idea I think that Jesus was expressing was not so much I'm going to correct all their behavior, but these are the social outcasts, and I am going to go be among them. And if healing needs to happen, then healing is going to happen. But the message of that was not these people, their behavior is all wrong. Because we don't really have many examples. Like maybe one example of Jesus actually calling someone he's having dinner with to repentance. For the most part, he just is having dinner with these folks, and then
and his ministry is a ministry
house.
of healing. That's what his whole deal was healing, teaching, and healing. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So they're the way that an awful lot of folks weaponize and leverage these stories from the Bible to try to serve their own structuring of power is not incredibly thoughtful. But
no,
but
it's also so embedded.
Yeah.
I mean, and that you start pulling at those threads, you're gonna find yourself with a whole mess. Because then you got to stop and ask yourself. And this is one of those weird places too, where like I turn into sort of a weird conspiracy theorist, and I start talking about, the consequences of like the Council of Nicaea and the political consequences and ramifications of the codification, I suppose, of Christianity as like, the overarching religion of Rome, which happened later or whatever.
Yeah.
Like when you look at the evidence of that, just from a historical perspective, and you look at how theology started to be used and manipulated, I mean, in order to create power structures that people did not have a whole lot of agency within, we forget very quickly how like you got like a head detached if you did not believe a certain theology. You know what I mean? And we don't realize that we are still doing that. We are constantly verbally beheading one another, and creating outcasts of one another. But I think that in order to recognize that, we have to recognize like our system and the way that our system operates and the way that it was patterned after a system that was designed to use religion to control. It's like it just becomes so messy for so many people.
Yeah. And once we get on the institutional level when it comes to religious belief, frequently the institution is going to prioritize whatever makes boundary maintenance the clearest and the easiest.
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard.
It's also like a problem of people don't realize that's what they're doing. They don't even, they don't have the self-awareness, and I don't either. I'm not saying anything about them. But they have no idea that is what they're doing and why they're doing it. It's like, so you can't even start with, don't do this because you have to start with, do you understand what you're actually attempting to accomplish here? Because the answer is almost always no.
Yeah. And like this creator who came into my comments and then was like, well, are you the right kind of Christian? That was because they had boundaries and they wanted to know if I was on the inside or the outside of those boundaries, because that's more important than anything else I have to say.
Yeah.
And that's how they're going to determine if you're right or wrong, is if you're on the right side of these questions, which is why, like, even intuitively, when if I'm talking with somebody, they're like, oh, I'm a Republican. I'm like, really? So it's that's just another kind of universal feature of the social identities that we have, that we identify with and that we identify against.
Identify against. And that's the part that we have to figure out, I think. Instead of like creating your identity around what you believe, it's creating your identity around the fact that you don't believe what they believe, which is part of the problem.
There's a term for that, schismogenesis.
Ooh, I love them $10 words.
So that's when you develop your identity based on your difference from an outgroup.
Yeah.
And those things become your central identity markers.
Yeah.
You create difference in order to as you kind of solidify an identity, and that happens, and that's just a natural part of human society.
Love that there's a word for that. That's great.
Say schismogenesis.
So that's
when
originating
you feed
difference.
a different person after midnight, right?
Yeah.
Someone who's not like you feed them after midnight, then you pour water on them, you get a schismogenesis.
Something like
Something
that.
like that.
Yeah. But yeah, that's an anthropological term that is used to describe how societies would kind of juxtaposed societies would begin to define themselves based on their difference from whoever's next to them or whoever's closest to them.
Which is one of the projects, like one of my personal pet projects deep in my heart. And because when I do professional development trainings, I do professional development trainings that are, socially just and culturally relevant. And one of the things I think really needs to be addressed in a professional development setting is the ways that schismogenesis was used to create the identity marker of white.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in and amongst, in the beginning of that creation of white, it was less about being white so much as it was about not being black. And so, when you had the creation of like quote unquote white privilege, it had to do with special privileges that white indentured servants were given over black servants. Like you could not whip a white servant naked, but you could whip a black slave naked.
Mm-hmm.
You, a white slave, a white indentured servant was able to correct a black slave in public, and strike a black slave, but a black slave couldn't strike a white slave.
Yeah.
And so it was designed to help indentured servants, or to force indentured servants to create a sense of identity that had to do with their whiteness rather than their class, which was exactly the same. I mean, you were also a slave in your own right. Now, you were going to not be a slave in 7 years, which, let's be frank, there's a big fat difference between a 7-year prison sentence and life in the hole. Okay. Mm-hmm. But on a social level, there was this symmetry, and there had to be a differentiation of that symmetry. Yeah. And I think that people don't recognize that. They walk around with this idea of white privilege. They don't understand where it came from.
Yeah. I think a better name is not whiteness, but not blackness.
Exactly.
Because that highlights that we are developing our idea of whiteness by distinguishing ourselves from this group. Because once you had, and that particularly becomes important when you have miscegenation, when you have interracial marriages and procreation and things like that. Suddenly it's like, oh crap, now we've got these categories close enough together that we need to define a boundary because we've made such a big deal about how different we are. And suddenly it's more of a spectrum, and so we've got to figure out where to draw that boundary. Not so that because it's important to our identity, but because it's important to us that we not overlap with the other identity.
Well, and let's get even more inflammatory, because I think this is the problem for most people with trans and non-binary folks, because the definition of masculine is not feminine. The definition of what is man is not feminine. Well, and that goes back to me for the Pythagorean table of opposites. These two things are opposite and they don't meet. You've got white, you've got dark, you've got man, you've got woman. Woman is attached to nature and all those things natural. Men is attached to all things spiritual and intellectual. So if you want to be a man, you can't be a woman. That's it. Yeah. And so when you have these individuals that are uncomfortable with those categories and don't believe that they should be locked into those categories, or God forbid, reject the category they were given at birth because that does not feel correct, and have the audacity to adopt the other identity. That's the thing in us that's actually becoming kicked up and problematic, is our definition of man is not woman. And so then how do we deal with that? And
even when it comes to women in sports, the reason that you initially have men are going to do their own one and women are going to do their own one is not because anybody wanted to protect women. It originated because women started challenging men, and they went, harumph. we're going to create a separate category for y'all.
That's fascinating.
Because there are a ton of different sports and athletic events where they originated in. We don't have a sex distinction.
Yeah.
But it was just always men.
Was it Billie Jean King?
And then
right, and the tennis.
Well, it didn't originate that, but
that's
yeah.
an example of it.
Yeah,
where
that's
like
an example of
you're
that.
perfectly capable of meeting masculine and feminine on the same court with the same capabilities.
When we
Karen
had
Rogers, female jockey, leading female jockey, just as good as all the dudes, better.
when you first woman to run the Boston Marathon was physically assaulted on the course by officials.
Yes.
Not because, wait a minute, we need to protect you. It's because how dare you
have the
encroach
audacity
upon our
right.
This is our thing. And so a lot of the divisions that we make to try to create these categories are primarily about preserving structures of power, not because they serve any other use. And then once they've been created, then we rationalize them. Then we say, oh, well, this is about making sure that women are protected.
And then we say, God said.
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes really dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and that's when it becomes really harmful, you know? And that's the part that's the impetus, right? Like that's the crux of all of this. Is when we take these human ideas and these cultural ideas that have been so imbibed and so woven into the fabric of society, we aren't even thinking about it. Like, nobody in my everyday life is walking around going, you know, I'm not really a girl. I'm just, you know, that masculinity doesn't have a definition. It's just, you know, I'm like I say this crap sometimes at dinner parties and it's just like crickets. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. My bad, you know, but these things are so when we don't challenge these things. And then we also say these things are not only like structures of our fabric of society, God made it that way on purpose. It's really, I mean, I left a church because, my church fell apart because it was in a tradition where you had to have male elders. And in that particular congregation, all of the people who had the capability of doing job of an elder because they didn't have small kids at home, they weren't working a full-time job, were retired women who were perfectly capable. But because that tradition did not acknowledge or allow women to be elders based on God said, you know, the entire church fell apart. So a very valuable place where many people were gathering together for spiritual enlightenment and gift and loving, and we would have these beautiful potlucks. That place was completely destroyed, and the pastor left, and all of our hearts were broken because God said women can't have power, right?
Even though God didn't say that, and Paul didn't even say that. Somebody lying about being Paul said that.
That's what got me.
And
that I know. That's where I get in trouble. See, that's where I get in trouble.
and today they're doing that with the interpreting Genesis 1:26 through 27 to assert a gender binary. And that's just because we're challenging this binary now. Oh, well, we got to find something in the Bible that demonstrates that God wanted it to be this way. Yeah. It's like, well, what if that's a merism, which is where you identify the two ends of a spectrum.
Right.
And it includes everything in between. So heaven and earth is widely recognized as a merism in Genesis 1. It means heaven and earth and everything in between. And so what if male and female he created them is a merism? They don't talk about that. Ancient Jewish tradition, there's one tradition that looks at the two creation accounts and says, okay, when Genesis 1:26 through 27 is talking about the creation of a single individual who is both male and female. And then Genesis 2, when they have woman being taken from man, was the separation of the original single individual into two separate sexes. And so there is an ancient Jewish tradition that understands that to have been the creation of humanity, which sounds an awful lot like the Symposium from Plato and Aristophanes' myth. But,
we talked about that in our whatever episodes.
Oh, really?
Because I have one of my classes was in Greek literature, and we talked about that. And it's a song from Hedwig and the Angry Inch that, you know, there's a song about it, something about the separation of, like, you know, mankind had to be, they were balls of people that had to be ripped apart, and that some men went to men, some women went to women, and some.
Because originally they had either matching genitals or they had different genitals.
Yeah, and they weren't getting anything done.
Yeah.
They weren't getting any work done.
Yeah.
So they had to separate them. Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So there's that kind of stuff is always coming up. They're always trying to find ways to say, well, God meant it this way by deploying the Bible.
Yeah.
And whatever is the next generation's big controversy is going to be something that nobody reads the Bible that way right now, but somebody's going to come up with a way to read the Bible so as to contradict and prohibit whatever the next generation's thing is.
And I think that's what I mean when I think about the ways that we don't take into account the consequences. I think a lot about like the Arian controversy, which, real in a nutshell is like, what is the nature of Christ, right? Is Christ a created being of the same substance as the rest of us, or is Christ a piece of God broken off and turned into flesh? Like, we are so enculturated to option B. That's what Jesus is. We don't realize that there was a period of time where that wasn't just accepted as the correct interpretation. We had to come to a place where that was an argument.
Yeah.
Arius
had the consensus view. Previous generations all would have been on Arius' side.
And that's the thing that for me is just absolutely mind-boggling. Like we do this thing where we take a decision of a synod, or we take a book that, Origen wrote, or we take a comment that Eusebius said, and we go, that's the Bible. And you're like, no, it's not. That's that person's individual interpretation of the Bible that we now have decided is clutch. But people will be like, oh, the Bible, God directed the Bible. Yeah. Which one?
Well,
and when?
A real quick example of this is in 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is theopneustos, God breathed, and is useful for
instruction and teaching
and reproof and instruction in righteousness and all that kind of stuff. What does theopneustos, God breathed, mean? Oh, everybody knows that means inspired. No, it didn't mean that until Origen said it meant that. Prior to that,
that was like my one question, because Serena talked about like when did inspiration become a thing?
Yeah, so Origen quotes that passage dozens of times. There's no writer prior to Origen that quotes it more than twice in all their life. But theopneustos, and there's a wonderful book called The Invention of the Inspired Text by John C. Poirier, and he points out, he shows the use of this word in a bunch of different early Jewish and early Christian literature. It meant God breathed in the sense of God breathed the breath of life into the first human. In other words, life-giving. And so when you look at the use of this word in other literature, like the Testament of Abraham and elsewhere, it talks about a stream being theopneustos, or sandals being theopneustos, or the ointment that you use to preserve a body for 3 days before burial in case its spirit comes back and the person comes back to life. That ointment is theopneustos. And so it means life-giving. And so 2 Timothy 3:16 is not saying all Scripture is inspired. It's saying all Scripture is life-giving, because there's a debate going on at this time period about the utility of the Hebrew Bible. Do we hold on to the Jewish Scriptures or not? And so
and he's saying, no, it's important.
Yeah, it's life-giving, and it's useful for reproof and instruction in righteousness and all this other stuff. But because thousands of years of Christians have understood it to mean inspired, the notion that it means something else does not compute, because there's just an entire universe of that usage.
It absolutely, and I think we are so unaware of how much of our dogmas and how much of our belief systems we have essentially deified. We have deified Origen, we have deified Eusebius, and we have certainly deified Augustine and Martin Luther. Because when people say that the Bible is the reason certain books were cut out, the Bible is the way that God wants it to be, I'm like, which one? The Catholic Bible? Because if you're talking, like, when people say that to me, it is Protestant evangelicals that say that to me, and I'm like, so then do you think that was the case before 1546, when the Bible that you're holding in your hand, came into material reality? Or is that when God got control? Or did God have control when these other books that were cut out of the Protestant Bible were actually still a part of it? So did it take God 1,500 years to get control of the word or not? Like, which one is it?
Yeah, and that's something I address in my book in the first chapter.
Oh,
about
tell
how
us about your book really quick. Tell us
Oh,
it's coming out because I'm like beyond excited.
the Bible says so. It'll be out April 15th, and each chapter is addressing a different claim about the Bible, what the Bible says, whether it's about homosexuality or abortion or Jesus being God, or
Yeah.
I talk about 2 Timothy 3:16
Yeah.
in, I think it's the second chapter actually, but so I go through and talk about all this kind of stuff and try to share to the best of my ability
Right.
what the data seem to indicate about the authors and the original audiences and how they would have understood it, and also talk a bit about in certain chapters about why we've come to understand it the way we have, and also in some places why the way we understand it is harmful, and how we need to get over it.
When is the pre-order for that?
Well, by the time this airs,
How can
will
I
probably
get
have
my? Well,
announced
this is
it.
going to air in like 2 weeks, probably.
Okay, well, if you just go to any bookseller and look for "The Bible Says So" by Dan McClellan.
You're not going to put a little link, so I have to figure out a way to like link that in the show notes.
Yeah, well, as soon as the pre-orders are available, it'll be on my link tree. So,
Okay, so folks, make sure you're following Dan McClellan on any and all of his social media, platforms. You're on Instagram, you're on TikTok, you have a blog, you have a website. So, go ahead and give Dan a follow and make sure that you're keeping your eyes peeled because I promise you, we're going to be talking about that book when it comes out in April. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good.
Well, man, this was a lot of fun.
That was excellent.
Thank
you.
And I'll tell you what, like, if we're trying to figure out how to do more long distance podcasting. I have 2 particular topics that I think are that I'm curious about, right? So like when I do my deep dives, sometimes I start with a preconceived notion and then I set out to make sure that I'm right.
Mm-hmm. Confirmation bias.
Absolutely. And I know 100% that that's what I'm doing. And I often will say that like at the get-go. I'm like, okay, guys, check it out. But sometimes I just have something that I'm curious about.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'm curious about, let me just put a bug in your ear and you can see what you think about it, is the nature of first century born again versus what it's become. Because I don't know that we fully understand the significance, especially in such a stratified society where you were born dictated a lot of your like mobility within society.
Mm-hmm.
How we talk a lot about born again and it being this like very significant part of becoming a Christian, like this, you got to say the magic words and you got to do all this whole thing. And I'm curious if that was always the case or if that became a thing, like that you got to speak the incantation, believe, what is it? What is it? Romans, believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord and confess to not that God raised him from the dead and then you should be saved. You got to walk in front of the church. You got to walk down that aisle. You got to do this thing. And then, but versus it being more an identity marker within first century Christianity, and it being how you choose to identify yourself in terms of power structures. So like you're not going to identify yourself as a Roman. You're not going to identify yourself. You're being born again. You're kind of starting over with your identity being that of this kind of like your leadership and authority is no longer like these people. It's this person over here, this Jesus, this other kingdom.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about when that turned into what we see now and today, which is like, again, like you have to say these certain magic words. You have to believe this certain thing, like it can't be like this just quiet, like, oh, cool. It's like this you have to be baptized and like start over. I'm just curious if that tradition that we have now is in line with what people in maybe first century Christianity would have thought, or if it's very different.
Almost certainly different, but yeah,
I gotta look into it.
Yeah, that's something I would have to look into as well. I don't know the history of the use of that phrase in conversion stories and things like that.
Yeah, I'm just curious. That's something that's interesting to me. Well, maybe I'll look into it.
Cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger. Come back. Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Once again, thanks for coming in. This was a heck of a lot of fun.
Well, thank you for having me. I
We
appreciate
certainly
it.
look forward to seeing you again. Folks, thanks for listening in. We'll see you next time on Notes from the Other Side. Well, no, because this is what we were talking about last night at dinner. Like, I exist in that tension point where I genuinely believe that an ascended being that shuffled off this mortal coil and then somehow still participates in our entire reality talks to me directly But I also believe in the cognitive science of religion. I also believe in the way that the brain works. I also believe that there's, something to do with the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. I also believe all these things. But I've also had things push me that weren't there. I've also watched a faith healer when there was no one else around. A guy had gotten polio when he was a kid, and so his legs were like this. And this guy, he specialized in back healings. But here's the thing. He came to my church when I was going to my First Assembly of God, because everybody wanted to come be a guest pastor at that church because they got a free trip to Maui. So I've seen Jesse Duplantis, I've seen, Benny Hinn, I've seen all these people. Well, so there was this like random dude, looked like Colonel Sanders, no joke. And he was so old at this point, he didn't want to talk about his faith healing anymore. Everyone came all like a buzz, and he wanted to talk about some nerdy theological thing about Paul. And so he does all this thing. Right. He was like, but he was old. He was like, no, we got to talk about the study. This is interesting stuff. And people left disappointed, right? And so me and my friend Ben, because I was going to Christian school at the time, and I've always been a friggin' dork. So I was like, well, I want to ask him a question about this theology. So I went over there, and me and Noah were waiting in line, and this guy like limped up, and he was like, I got this one leg, and it's shorter than the other one. And it's from polio or whatever. And he was like, oh, okay. And I swear to you all, he grabbed that man by the heel and was like, in the name of Jesus. And he like pulled, and that guy's leg grew. There was no cameras. There was no money. There was no one involved. Me and Noah about shat ourselves. We were like, what? And then the guy started crying, and he just got up and left. And then the guy was like, what was your question? And we were like, I don't know. I don't know. So it's like, yeah.
Greg is leash trained. I mean, as much as you can leash train a cat, you don't really walk a cat. You bring a cat places and see what it feels like doing. He's gotten
so big.
Yeah, he's a big boy. Yeah, I'm glad. And his tail is so fluffy.
I know.
Greg's
a delight.
I take him to breweries and stuff. It's fun. I love it. Silly.
Yeah.
It's a silly hobby, but
Yeah.